Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this live feed we're going to be discussing punishment and its use in animal training today. And so before we do that, just want to say a quick hello and see who's logged in and viewing today and discussing it with us. Hopefully you guys have lots of questions and discussion points that you can join in with and discuss. So if you want to type into the comments box and just say hello and where you're from. Hi Jill. How are you doing? So I see some familiar faces. It tells me if I swipe left I can see who's watching. I can see Louise is watching as well. Hi Louise, how are you? Sarah is watching as well. Hi Sarah, how are you? Okay, so why do this Facebook live feed? A couple of weeks ago, or actually maybe even last week, I was on a walk with Cody, and Cody's my dog, Kelpie. He's chewing a bone somewhere. We were in the park, going for a little walk. He was off leash, walking along, and another dog came running up to him. Now, looked very friendly, body language seemed relaxed, and he had a little sniff behind Cody, followed along. Anywhere Cody cocked his leg and marked, the other dog marked as well. They're both entire males. They both seemed quite relaxed around each other, and it went on for about a few minutes. After that, we went round into the fields. The dog kind of followed along. And then I see a guy, and he's calling his dog over, and he's kind of walking towards the dog in a fast, enthusiastic way with an angry expression on his face. And the dog runs over towards him, albeit quite slowly, and I see the dog's body language change. And as I see the dog's body language change as he approaches the guy, I think, oh, maybe I know what's gone on before, because the dog's ears are back, his tail's starting to tuck, he's really slowing down. And he gets close to the guy and then stands still, and then the guy walks over to his dog, and I see him pick up a little twig, and it was just a small twig off the floor. And then he takes the twig and he starts to wave it above the dog's head, and then I think he touches the dog with it or hits the dog with it towards the base of the tail. And he continues doing this for a few seconds, and the dog kind of sits with his ears down, and then he walks a couple of steps and he does it again, and then he drops the stick on the floor and then walks off. And so I saw that and I thought, so what would I do in that moment, or what could I do in that moment that's going to inspire some change? And there's so many misconceptions about punishment and its use in training. And for me, one of my philosophies working with animals, and that's human animals and non-human animals, is to inspire change, is to empower, is not to make people feel bad or to punish them or punish their behaviours like I would focus on a positive reinforcement approach with animals. That's the approach that I want to take with my human caregivers too. And so I'm a huge advocate for, when I'm working with human caregivers, to want to have them participate as opposed to comply. So this idea of client compliance, I think, needs to go out the window, and we need to be talking about clients wanting to participate in their training sessions. And so I decided in that moment, as we were walking along, that I wasn't going to intervene in any way, because if I was, I think the guy would have become defensive or maybe upset about the intervention. I just carried on my walk, and during the walk, anytime we were in the field, I'd call Cody over, and if Cody came running to me, I'd make a big effort and fuss of throwing lots of treats towards him. I'd grab a toy out of my pocket and play tuggy, and then just so the guy could see a positive example of what we want to do when dogs approach, as opposed to hitting them when his dog came back. Now, I don't judge the guy, and I don't think the guy was evil or bad or didn't care about his dog, because if I look back sort of 16, 17 years ago, I remember working with my German Shepherd, Kane, and when I got him, he bit a few people, and he used to attack other dogs, and I took him to a training class run by ex-policemen, and I was taught to put a choke chain on, use it right at the top of his neck. And if you ever watch certain TV programs where you see the leash right at the top of the dog's neck, or you see choke chains used and they're used up here, the reason they use them up here is because if you take your hand and push, it's hard to breathe. So just above the Adam's apple, if you push in, it's hard to breathe, and that's why those tools are quite effective with dogs too, is that they kind of stop the dog breathing. So in that situation, one of the things that we find is I didn't do that because I used to hate my dog. I used to do that because that's what I was told by the trainer. That's what I thought was correct. And from a common sense point of view, it made sense that if I was strict on my dog, if he went to bite someone, I was to punish him or correct him, then he would learn and his behaviours would improve. But actually, science tells us differently. And so that's some of the things I want to discuss today. And so that's one of the reasons I did this Facebook Live, is to kind of discuss punishment and its use in training, because I think hopefully it will inspire more change, and you guys are obviously working with clients and people and animals, and it will help change the people that you interact with too. So most of the people, and I can see a lot of people have joined us on this live view everywhere from all over the world. We've got 215 people watching so far, so hello to everyone. Thanks for joining us. And I know a lot of people watching already focus on a positive reinforcement training approach. So let's start with the idea of popular punishment, in terms of when we think about punishment, what do we think about? Traditionally, when we think about punishment, we think about a penalty. We think that someone's done something wrong and we need to punish their act of behaving. Now, we want to punish them either as an individual or try and almost an eye for an eye. Because they've done something wrong, so surely they should suffer something in return. And there's a really good quote by Mahatma Gandhi, which I really like, which is, "An eye for an eye only makes the whole world blind." And so when we think about punishment from a popular point of view, it's often to get back at someone, or emotionally when we think about, we almost feel better because that person has done something to us, we do something to punish them, and we almost feel some kind of relief, or some kind of, we feel almost good that we've almost done that punishing act that the person suffered. Whereas from a learning point of view, punishment is slightly different. When we talk about punishment, we're talking about reducing behaviour. And so when we talk about reinforcement, we're talking about strengthening behaviour. When we talk about reinforcing something, you reinforce a building or you reinforce an object, you're making it stronger. And that's the same with behaviour. When we talk about reinforcing behaviour, we're talking about increasing the strength on that behaviour. So that behaviour is going to happen more often, it's going to happen for maybe longer, it's going to happen quicker. There's lots of ways we can strengthen behaviour. And when we talk about punishment, we're often talking about reducing behaviour, weakening that strength, and so that behaviour will happen less often. Maybe it will take longer to occur. And so when we talk about punishment, we're talking about reducing behaviour. Now, there is also this idea that punishment is the opposite to rewards or reinforcement. And actually, if we look back at some of the early works, even people in terms of Thorndike or Skinner, they were actually talking about the fact that actually punishment isn't the opposite to rewards. And that might come as a surprise to some people, because people think, well, reinforces strengthen behaviour, punishes weaken them, so surely they're just completely the opposite. If we don't want something, we're going to punish it. If we want something more of something, we're going to reinforce it. But when they did early experiments, so they reinforced certain behaviours, whether it was lever pressing in a Skinner box with rats, and then they put that behaviour on extinction, meaning no more reinforcers were available for that behaviour, and then they started looking at what would happen if we applied a punisher, whether that be the addition of something or the removal of something, and they found that actually temporarily the behaviour would decrease or would happen less often, but over a period of time the behaviour came back. And if they looked on an extinction curve, they still saw the same number of responses occur that would have occurred had no punishment been applied. And so very early on, Thorndike actually changed his law of effect. And we're talking about in 1931, he revised his law of effect to talk about focusing on reward strengthening behaviours, and that actually punishers, in his opinion, didn't have the same effect as at weakening behaviour long term. In the short term, they saw a slight decrease or a change in behaviour, but long term, that effect wasn't there. And then following on from Thorndike's work, Skinner in 1951, in his book The Science and Human Behaviour, and I have a copy here with me. It's a really good book. If you haven't had a read, it's worth having a read. It's quite intense. If you're a science geek like me, there's lots of geeky stuff to get into. But Skinner actually talks about in his book back in 1951 that in the long run, punishment, unlike reinforcement, works to the disadvantage of both the punished organism and the punishing agency, meaning it works at a disadvantage to who's being punished and the punisher themselves. And he goes into detail as to why he believes that's the point. And he also talked about the fact that when looking at definitions of punishment, and so there's lots of different ways to define punishment, and we're not going to get into real nitty-gritty science here, but if we look back at how Skinner defined punishment or looked at defining it, it's very different to some of the modern definitions of punishment. And so it's really worth looking at what actually does it mean. And so for our discussion, we're just going to look at it as something that reduces behavior. But like I said, remember, the science or the data seems to suggest that it reduces behavior temporarily and short term, but in the long term what tends to happen is the behavior comes back. We call that recovering from punishment. So when the behavior is no longer punished, the behavior seems to happen again. And so we know that punishment reduces behavior temporarily, but what other effects are there? Now, there's a number of side effects that occur to the use of punishment, and I want to discuss some of those. Now, one of the things that is worth mentioning is I mentioned that punishment from a learning point of view is about reducing behavior. So when we talk about punishing, we're not talking about punishing the individual. So we're not trying to, from an emotional point, get our revenge or get back at someone or get back at an animal. So say your animal goes to bite you, or the animal goes and rips something in an enclosure, or chews your furniture. The point of punishment from a learning point of view should be to reduce that behavior from occurring in the future, not to get back at the animal. But remember what I've just said, which is, yes, short term, if we punish appropriately, then that behavior may reduce temporarily, but long term, is it going to have a lasting effect? And so what alternatives are there? And we can discuss those alternatives as we go through our discussion today. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to type them in the chat box, and hopefully I'll be able to see them and we can discuss them. So one of the effects of punishment is that it's situational. So when we punish a behavior, what often happens is it's punished under certain conditions. So when you walk into the house, or you're at home watching TV and your parrot is chewing the curtains, and you go to punish the parrot's behavior of chewing the curtains, you may see that the curtain chewing behavior stops or decreases. However, learning always happens under certain conditions, and those conditions are the presence of you sitting there watching TV. And what will happen is the parrot will learn very quickly that when the human isn't sitting there watching TV, or the human isn't present, it's actually safe to chew the curtains. When the human is there, it's unsafe. Now notice I use the word safe and unsafe as opposed to right or wrong, because animals don't tend to, generally, from what we know, learn in terms of right or wrong or morally. The animal doesn't sit there going, well, it's immoral, or my owners won't like it if I do this. Often what's happening is the animal's learning that behavior is safe under certain conditions, and behavior is dangerous under certain conditions. So when your animal does chew something and you go to tell them off, remember, it may reduce the behavior of chewing something in your presence, but when you're not there, then who's there to punish that behavior? And so the animal's going to learn it's safe to do so. And we see that all the time. We see animals who, when we leave the room, or we go to the bathroom, or the dog or puppy will go behind the sofa and pee, because when they go behind the sofa it's safe, whereas they pee in front of you, it's unsafe. There's also this idea of, well, he knows he's done wrong. And I hear a lot of people say to me, he looks guilty, or the animal looked guilty. Now, by looking guilty, what does that look like physically? Often we see an animal who shows more baby-like features, features of a younger animal. So for dogs, they look more puppy-like. And what could that be? Is that the dog feeling guilty? Well, we don't have any data to suggest that the animals are actually feeling guilty in that moment in time. What's probably likely to be happening is they're using their behaviour to appease a situation. So in that moment, their behaviour functions as an escape or avoidance behaviour. If the puppy or if the dog looks more puppyish, they're making themselves less threatening. And so if they're less threatening, they're trying to reduce conflict. So say there's two dogs and they're about to get into a fight, or one dog does something. If one dog looks more puppy-like or starts appeasing, goes on their back, the ears go back, then that's going to reduce confrontation. Whereas if they stare at the other dog and their ears are forward and their tail's forward, that's more confrontational. Think about when you're walking down the street or you're around the person, you're trying to reduce conflict, you'll look away, you'll do things that are likely to reduce conflict, and that's what the dogs are doing, or that's what animals are doing. And so when we see that guilty animal, don't think that the animal is apologising. If they're apologising, why would they do the behaviour again? Often a lot of those animals will keep peeing when you leave them in the house, or they'll still chew your curtains, or they'll still do the things that you don't want them to do. I don't think the animals are saying sorry for doing them. All they're doing is they're seeing a change in the situation. The human seems more angry, or their voice seems raised, and previously under those conditions more punishers are available, and so the animals start to appease in that situation. Now when I talk about punishment being situational and the animal learns it's situational, you're going to have to go into many different situations and punish that same behaviour. So say we've got an animal who lunges at children or growls at children. If you punish that behaviour, then the animal learns under these conditions it's dangerous, under these conditions it's safe. The animal doesn't learn to like children anymore. And so then potentially you're going to have to do the same thing in the park, you're going to have to do the same thing at home, and you're going to have to do them in so many different places. Now the other effect of doing this is going to be that potentially the animal starts, when we use something that's aversive, it can cause negative emotions, and also the animal can start to feel unsafe in those situations. We also know, so animals will start to try and escape or avoid, and in Skinner boxes, or when experiments were done when animals were confined, animals would actually try and escape, jump out of those boxes. And so that comes back to the point I was just making about them showing appeasement behaviours to try and escape from that situation. Other things that animals will do is actually show more aggressive behaviour. So under those conditions that predict that something aversive is going to happen, some animals will actually start to retaliate. So they'll start to become more defensive before they actually get the shock, or before the human starts to apply the punisher. So I've seen animals who actually start to growl as soon as they see the facial expression change of the human, because they've learned when the human's face changes, something bad's going to happen, or when the person enters the house, they're going to get told off. So the dog actually starts growling or going to bite them before that happens. And so animals can start to show aggressive behaviour. And again, in experiments, they found that animals would actually start to sometimes attack the lever, or they'll actually start to show aggressive behaviour to an object inside the box. And so when we're going to apply punishers, there's going to be fallout in terms of the animals potentially going to learn to show aggressive behaviours in those situations. Now, I used an example a little while ago of a dog growling and in the presence of a child. Now say we're punishing that growling behaviour, what are we actually punishing? If we think about the function of that behaviour for that individual animal, that animal may learn to use growling to be able to escape or avoid. So if they're walking down the street and a child appears, they growl, and the human pulls the dog away, or the child crosses the road, and it's a successful strategy. The child moves away. So currently, the behaviour of growling, or showing a precursor to biting, is a successful way of increasing distance. However, if we punish that behaviour, essentially we could be teaching the animal to stop warning us. So the animal will learn, don't give any warning behaviours, because they're dangerous. So what else is the animal left with, apart from escalating the behaviour, and they're more likely to bite without the warning. So when people say, he's unpredictable, or she's unpredictable, well, maybe the animal was predictable previously, but through the learning history of the animal, what's happened is the animals learn that certain behaviours don't pay off anymore. So When we think about using punishment, we have to think about all these possible side effects as well. And are they going to help us in the long term, or are they not? So let's come back to this example of the dog growling at the child. So say we were to punish the dog for growling at the child. What associations are we going to form? Now, associations are always being formed when animals learn behaviours. For example, if you open up a tin of dog food, or you pick up your dog's leash, or you work with larger animals like sea lions, or say dolphins or tigers, if you approach with a bucket of meat, how does the animal, they approach the fence, but what kind of body language do you see? What kind of excitability? How do you think the animal's feeling in that situation? Now, where did those feelings come from, or how did that feeling appear? They came through the contingencies of reinforcement. When the animal comes running up in the presence of a bucket, lots of fish appears, or lots of good things appear, and the animal feels happier as well. Now, when we start to apply punishers around that animal that's growling at the child, the behaviour of growling may stop when you're present, because it's dangerous to do it in that situation when the child's around. But what emotions and feelings are we going to cause? The animal's going to start to feel uncomfortable in that situation. When they see a child, it's going to make them feel anxious, it's going to make them feel unhappy, unrelaxed. And so now we've got an animal that sees a child, is less likely to warn them because the warning behaviour is being punished, but also feels more uncomfortable around them. So if a child was to get too close, or you were to have visitors at your home and you weren't watching your dog, and the dog's got a high punishment history around children, the child gets closer and closer to that dog, what's the dog likely to do? They're going to feel really uncomfortable, and potentially they're also going to bite in that situation. And so it's really important to think about what associations could be being formed. And we know, even through experiments, that when punishers are applied, they rarely just have an effect on the behaviour in that situation. What starts to happen is the animal starts to also generalise to the other things in that environment. So if there was certain music playing in the background, or if there was certain levers on the wall, when all of those things are there, the animal actually starts to behave in a way that anticipates that the punisher could be happening. So under those aversive conditions, animals would actually start to form connections with their general environment. So when you think, well, I'm just punishing that specific behaviour because my timing was excellent, I was very specific with when I punished, you can't control what's happening around you. Unless you're in a completely sterile environment, there's lots of other things happening. There could be noises, there could be children playing, there could be the doorbell could be ringing, it could be music, there could be the wind blowing, and potentially we could start to associate all of those different stimuli with those feelings of being uncomfortable and being anxious because we punished at a time. So they're all the things that we want to think about. So we've mentioned how it could be situational, meaning potentially the animal's going to learn under those conditions, the behaviour is unsafe or dangerous, and so we're going to have to punish in so many different situations for it to have an effect. But also the animal's going to start to not just learn that specific behaviour is dangerous in that situation, but they're going to learn the rest of the environment could make them feel uncomfortable and happy in that situation. We know it causes animals to feel more anxious, unrelaxed. It's likely to cause animals to want to escape or avoid. And so if something's going to cause animals to escape or avoid, and they start showing all those appeasement behaviours, then are they really learning under those situations what we want them to learn, or are they now just focusing on escape or avoidance? If I wanted you to learn something, but you needed to escape or avoid, are you going to be sitting there going, oh, sorry, I meant to do it this way? Or is your focus more on being able to get out of that situation? And so if I want you to learn, surely creating a more relaxed situation is going to allow you to learn what I want you to learn, as opposed to you wanting to escape the whole time. We discussed how punishers could cause more aggressive behaviours, and so animals are more likely to maybe retaliate in those situations. And then the last point that I haven't mentioned is how reinforcing it is to the punisher. So when I apply a punisher to my animal or my learner, it reinforces my behaviour, because often in the short term we see that behaviour decrease or stop. So the example that I used of the parrot chewing the curtain, you apply your punisher and the parrot's behaviour of chewing the curtain stops for a moment or temporarily, And so your behaviour is reinforced because it worked, it had an outcome. So then the next time, you're more likely to resort to that behaviour. And then the next time, again, you're more likely to. And then if it stops working, we go under extinction conditions, meaning a previously reinforced behaviour, something that worked, no longer works. So what happens in those situations? When you put money into a Coca-Cola machine, and then you expect a drink to fall out all the time, and now you put money in and the drink doesn't come out, often you experience high levels of frustration, and you may be more intense. You might try thumping the machine. That happens with behaviour too. When you're successful at doing something and it pays off, and now it stops paying off, what we're going to see is that you actually may feel more frustrated, and we see more operant variability. So you're going to try maybe the same behaviour but doing it differently. You might be more intense. So say with the parrot chewing the curtain, you normally spray them with a water bottle, or you shout at them, or you get a newspaper and you move the newspaper towards them. Then because now it doesn't work anymore, you might try touching them with the newspaper, or you might try tapping them in the newspaper. Rather than one squirt of the water bottle, you might try 2 or 3 squirts. And so for the punisher, it becomes really reinforcing. And that could be a dangerous trap to get into, because then we're going to be going to that a lot more sooner than we should be for each individual animal. So we've kind of talked about the popular definition of punishment, how people generally tend to think about it. We've discussed it in relevance a little bit to a learning point of view, and we've talked about some side effects to punishers. Now, the other area that I wanted to go to was what behaviours are we punishing? Why are we punishing those behaviours? So when our animals are doing something, we decide that we want to reduce that behaviour, and like I mentioned also, it's worth remembering that a lot of the research actually shows that punishers have a temporary effect. In the long term, those behaviours recover if punishment isn't followed through. So again, when we're punishing, are we really working towards a long-term goal? So when we think about what behaviours we're going to punish, why are those behaviours worthy of being punished? Is it because they make us feel angry? Our dog chews the furniture, or the sea lion goes to bite us, and because they go to bite us we feel angry? Or are those normal behaviours for animals to do? So if we live with a pet dog, if we live with a pet parrot, if we work with dolphins or sea lions or lions, there's going to be behaviours which are normal lion behaviours. There's going to be behaviours which are normal dog behaviours. Why live with a dog if we want to punish them for behaving like a dog? Why live with a parrot if we are going to punish parrot-like behaviours? So when we think about behaviours to select for, or select out of or against, we have to think, are they normal social behaviours for animals to show that are species specific, but also they function for the individual, they have an important outcome for that individual? And if they are, then we have to ask the question, is it really worth, just because I don't like that behaviour, is it worth applying a punisher to? Is there other ways we can deal with that? The other thing for me is the philosophy. I'm going to share with you my philosophy to animals and animal care and training. So, and it was influenced by people like Ken Ramirez, who really opened my eyes to this. So when we train, or when we care for an animal, I like to think of animals as not choosing to be in the situations they are. Now that sounds obvious when we're talking about an orangutan. If we talk about an orangutan in a zoo, or a dolphin in an aquarium, we think, well, that animal doesn't have a choice to be there, they're a wild animal. But as soon as we apply the label of domestic, how much do we get away with? We often don't think about, we don't say, well, the dog, do we think about the dog not choosing to be in that situation? We think, well, they're domestic, surely they should be okay living with humans. Well, just because they're domestic doesn't mean they've chosen to come and live in our household. When a dog comes to live with us, or when an animal comes under our care, they don't choose what they eat. They don't get to choose when they have access to water. They don't get to choose if they get to reproduce. They don't get a lot of control of the environment. They don't get to control when they get access to food. There's a lot of times we're controlling most of those things. So control, food, sex, water. What about safety? Can the animal gain access to a safe place? Well, that's contingent on how have we arranged the environment. So essentially, when an animal lives with us, we've taken away most of the control that animal has. And so what makes us then think that we now have to control the animal even more? A lot of times when we work with animals, we think because we have to control them, or the animals living with us, we need to be in charge. But if we wake up to the fact that we're already controlling the majority, if not all, of our animals' lives, if they have access to social mates, if they can get access to loads of things that cause pleasure in life, why do we want to control them even more? So whether we're talking about a rabbit or a giraffe, we have to remember animals don't choose to live in the situations we put them in. Now some people say to me, but what about rescue animals? What about rescue animals? Rescue animals are only labeled rescued because they were rescued because humans caused those situations in the first place most often. Most often what's happened is because of human behaviour, those animals end up in rescue, and then we either go and volunteer at a rescue centre, or we rescue an animal and we feel good about ourselves. We say, we rescued an animal. Well, we shouldn't feel great that we've rescued an animal, because the animal didn't actually choose to be in that situation in the first place. If we go and work in a rescue centre, we shouldn't be thinking, well, the animal should need to be grateful that I turn up, because if I wasn't turning up, the animal wouldn't get walked, or the animal wouldn't get enrichment or exercise. We should be going there because we're going there because we want to volunteer and help these animals that are in those situations. No fault personally that we've put them in there, but because of humans, they've ended up in that situation. So even with a rescue animal, I don't think the animal has anything to be grateful for. If anything, we're the ones who choose to bring that rescue animal into our lives. So then we can't expect that animal to change their behaviour to make our lives easier. For me, when we work with animals, it should be about making their life easier. First and foremost, when we decide to either take in an animal that's going to live with us, or we go and work with an animal, our job is to be an animal trainer or animal keeper, our responsibility is to go into work or live with that animal and make their lives easier. Not the other way around. But often when we live with animals, we think about it as, well, I'm living with the animals, so surely if the animal did this, if they were more obedient, then that would be quicker and easier for me. We're always thinking about me as opposed to the animal. And I think, remember, we're the ones who chose to keep the animal. And so maybe we should make it more about them. So when we're training and working with animals, I think all of these things influence, am I going to use something that's going to cause them to feel fear or anxious? Am I going to do something that's maybe having more side effects, maybe more likely for them to display aggressive behaviours in a certain situation? Now, there's different types of punishers, and people hear the things, words such as timeout. And so when people say to me, but I use a timeout and I'm not causing the animal to feel scared, and I'm not presenting anything that's going to make the animal feel fearful, surely that's okay, the animal has to learn. Well, first of all, my question is, tell me for you what a timeout looks like, because every time I consult and I work with different people, timeouts look different, and when they're applied very differently, and they have different functions. Sometimes I watch people do a timeout, and actually, when I watch the animal's behaviour, the behaviour isn't decreasing, it's actually increasing. And what happens is the animals learn that by doing this behaviour, I can get the human to go away. So they can actually get escape or avoidance from whatever the human is making the animal do, or trying to get the animal to do, by behaving in a certain way, because the human moves away. I've worked with primates, apes that all learn to pee or squirt urine or throw feces, and the human moves away, and they can actually get the human to stop nagging them or doing whatever they were doing. I've seen lots of animals do that. We as humans do that. We do certain things because we've learned that if I do this, then I can escape or avoid a certain situation. And so we need to be asking, why does the animal do what they're doing in that situation? What function does it serve them? Any questions so far? Let's see if you guys are asking questions. Very quiet, or maybe I'm just not seeing the questions. Okay, so we were talking about timeouts and non-aversive ways of applying punishers potentially. So people, sometimes I hear people say to me, well, I just step away from I take the treats away if the dog does something, or I'll just take a step away with the bucket of food. That's non-aversive. But like I've mentioned, that sometimes when we do a timeout, we have to watch what the animal's doing, because their behavior may be functioning to actually go, yes, I can get the human to escape or go away. And the other thing about timeouts is, when you're not there and you take away the reinforcers, you aren't actually teaching, because you can't teach with the absence of behaviors. Reinforcers teach. They teach the animal what we want them to do. By removing reinforcers, we're not teaching anything. So surely every time we give a timeout, we're just creating moments in time where the animal hasn't got an opportunity to learn. So the more timeouts they have in a training session, there's more wasted opportunities where we could have actually been educating the learner. Now, if we do a timeout, meaning we take away something that the animal wants or is going to strengthen their behavior, something that could be acting as a positive reinforcer, we have to ask, why did we need to apply that timeout? So, for example, I'm engaging in a training session, and say we're working with, we're working with a sea lion, and we go to do something or touch an area, and the sea lion goes to bite. Or we go to touch the dog's ear and the dog goes to bite. We do a timeout. Why does the animal need a timeout in that situation? The animal's behavior functions to communicate to us. They only behaved in that way because we pushed the wrong buttons. We created a situation where the animal felt they needed to behave in a way to get us to move away. Potentially they've learned also over the number of previous training sessions that they need to bite in order to get human hands to move away. If we were training in a way that we were having a conversation with the animal, we were listening and watching what the animal was doing, and we were looking at the nuances. So when we were working with the animal, I'd watch the animal's whiskers, or I'd watch their respiration rate, I'd watch their blinking, I'd watch their ear positions, I'd watch how the animal looks away. And as I asked the animal to do something, or say I went to move my hand towards the animal's ear, and the animal just slightly shifted their body weight away, my hand disappeared. That animal would learn that, oh, every time I shift my body weight away, the hand disappears. So they have no reason to bite, because they've learned that they can whisper and they can have an effect on the environment. The animal only learns to bite because when that hand comes forward and their body moves away, often the hand keeps coming forward and moving away doesn't work anymore. And then when the animal does go to bite, the hand disappears. So the animal learns biting means the hand will move away. So potentially, if we have an animal who does show a high biting behavior, or a high frequency of biting, we need to ask that maybe we haven't been as observant and as respectful to that individual learner as we needed to be during the previous training sessions. And maybe that's not our fault as a personal trainer, as you as the individual trainer, because it could have been other people working with the animal before you, if they're in a zoo or in a different environment. But they're all the things that we have to be aware of. And if that animal has had lots of conflicted information, meaning sometimes certain things work, other times they don't work, so a certain individual animal has learned, oh, sometimes in their learning history, moving away works and that really pays off, but then other times it doesn't work because a hand coming close, it keeps coming, then potentially we start getting more unpredictable behavior. And I've seen animals, people say to me, oh, the animal's so unpredictable, if only they were more predictable. Well, nothing inside the animal made them unpredictable. That unpredictability came from their learning history. Because of the inconsistency they've had, the animal shows more unpredictable behaviors. So how do we make the animal behave in a more predictable way? Not as in make. How do we encourage the behavior to be more predictable? We become more predictable, or we start making training sessions and learning environments more predictable. That may mean if there's lots and lots of people working with individual animals, we need to have better education programs for all those people working with those animals. Now, coming back to timeouts again, so there's lots of different, I see from our audience we have loads of different people, we have 307 people joining us from all over the world at the moment, and some of the people joining us work with more exotic species, some people work with more domestics, And so I wanted to mention the use of things like LRS, the least reinforcing stimulus. Now there's a few different takes and interpretations of it, and a few different people teach it in different ways. So if you are familiar with it, then you may have one version, and if you talk to someone else, they might apply it slightly differently. I've seen it applied where the animal does something and the trainer goes neutral for a second, or just stays in that position for a second. So say they're standing in front of the animal, they just freeze for a couple of seconds, and some people count to 3 and then they just continue. So if the animal's calm after 3, they reinforce, they ask for a behaviour and they continue. Other people do it where that pause isn't always 3 seconds or count to 3. It's just almost a pause that interrupts the rhythm of training. So say they're reinforcing a behaviour, they're reinforcing another behaviour, they're reinforcing another behaviour, and the animal does a certain behaviour. They pause for a second and they don't change what they're doing, but that momentary pause is just a blip in that rhythm of reinforcement. So that's another way. Often when they've done this, the animals have learned through early learning history that when the trainer pauses or is stationary, if the animal is nice and calm, that's an opportunity to engage or gain more reinforcement. Now, one of the things I want to mention about that is, although that seems really nice in terms of we're not hurting the animal, we're not causing the animal to feel fearful, just remember that the more LRSs, or the more those events that you have in your training session, the opportunities where you're not reinforcing. And reinforcement is what strengthens behaviour. Punishers don't. Absence of reinforcers don't strengthen. They don't teach the animal what you want them to do. So, and then also ask yourself, why did the animal do what they did? And don't put the explanation inside the animal. Don't try and read the animal's mind. Don't do a Mystic Meg. Ask what in the environment it gives the animal information that those behaviours are more likely to be successful. So if I'm working 2 or 3 animals and I'm starting to see that one animal is constantly displacing another, or every time I go to feed, one animal snatches the food, or they start giving the other animal dirty eye, or they run after the other animal and they chase them out the way, why do you keep applying, or why do we need to keep applying a timeout on LRS or something of that sort? Because we know that under those conditions this behaviour is more likely. So why don't we change the environment? Let's have the animals further away, or let's have different individuals next to each other so they don't feel the need to displace the animal, and then teach them using reinforcement to be comfortable and calm and relax and station calmly with those animals getting closer and closer and closer. So we think, okay, in this moment in time we may just need a time out for a second. The animal's done something, I'm just going to take a step back because I just want to pause. And the pause may be more beneficial to us as well, because something's just happened, we just want to take a moment to breathe. But what we should be doing is thinking, how am I going to change my behaviour and the environment to make sure I don't have to apply another timeout, and I can minimise and make it harder for the animal to show the behaviour I don't want, and I can make it more likely and easier for the animal to show the behaviour that I want. And if, say for example, you ask the animal for a blood draw behaviour, so I ask my animal to present their paw or present their neck or present their tail, and yesterday the animal could show me that behaviour. Today I ask for the behaviour and the animal doesn't give me the full paw, they turn halfway or they offer me another body part. Then rather than saying the animal's being stubborn, let's ask what in the environment could have meant that the animal behaved differently today. Because behaviour happens due to the environment, and so if the environment's different, the animal's going to behave differently. So if today you're feeling slightly more rushed, or you're more anxious because you need to get off somewhere, or you need to do something, or you're distracted in terms of someone's talking to you and the animal's in front of you, maybe all of those are factors why the animal's behaving differently today. Maybe it could be pain. Maybe today you've asked the animal to work close to another animal that they're not so comfortable with, or yesterday they were comfortable with that animal and today they're not. Think of us humans, we don't always get on with everyone, and sometimes we like people more, we like people less, depending on the situation, the environment, the day, our relationship, all of those things. They happen with animals too. So sometimes when animals don't do the behaviours that we want them to do, or that we ask of, Just because they could do those behaviours yesterday doesn't mean the animal's wrong today. It just means the environment's different. And rather than then trying to punish the animal, say, he could do it yesterday, so I'm giving them a timeout. Well, the timeout isn't going to make it more likely for the animal to show the behaviour today. What's going to make it more likely is asking, oh, well, let's teach the animal that actually when animal 4 is next to you rather than the other animal that they're more comfortable with, actually turning away from the animal and going to move their tail into my hands pays off really highly. And maybe I'm not going to ask them to move their tail all the way into my hands. I'm just going to ask them to turn their body, and as they start going to turn their body before their tail even gets near me, I'm going to click, I'm going to bridge, and I'm going to reinforce them. So they start to learn actually turning your body away from that other animal that you don't like actually still pays off. But we're also going to make sure that that other animal is under control in terms of with their trainer, they're not likely to be able to run off or come in and displace this animal while they're doing the behaviour, because otherwise they're going to learn, when I ask for that tail present, it's dangerous because the other animal could attack them. So we look at the environment and we set the environment up so the animal's going to be most successful. Now, so we've talked about timeouts, and the reason I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about timeouts is because I hear so many trainers talk about, well, I'm a positive reinforcement based trainer, and timeouts are something I use because it doesn't cause the animal to feel upset. But actually, when you take things away that the animal wants, that could actually cause them to feel highly frustrated. So think about that. If we're really focusing on being a positive reinforcement trainer and we're constantly taking away the bucket of fish, or we're constantly taking away the goodies that the animal actually wants, then we're potentially causing the animal to feel quite frustrated in that situation. And so why don't we ask, what is it that we want the animal to do? So a question I want you to leave with today is, if the animals are doing things that we don't want them to do, let's focus on what is it that we want them to do. Let's ask, what is it in the environment that makes it at the moment easier for them to show the behaviours that they're doing? So the parrot, coming back to the example of the parrot chewing the curtains, if we move their cage away from the curtains, that makes it less likely they're going to chew the curtains. If we give them more objects to chew on their perch or their cage, so maybe let's get some towels, cut them up and put them all over their cage. Now the animal has soft materials that they can chew on in their cage as opposed to the curtains. Also, we ask, what's the function? Susan Friedman says, WTF? What's the function of that behaviour? So if the function of that behaviour is to gain attention, I was working with a cat recently, and the cat would pee on lots of different surfaces and objects. And it started off, the behaviour started when the cat had a urinary infection a number of years ago. But still, the cat, after 2-3 years, pees on the bed or on soft surfaces. Now, maybe it made it more likely, or made it more reinforcing, the behaviour more reinforcing to pee on a soft surface when you had an infection, because if you're constantly peeing and there's not enough litter in the litter tray, potentially the feet get wet and that could be more punishing, whereas if you pee on a soft surface or an absorbent surface, then the urine dissipates or gets absorbed, and so you don't end up getting your feet all wet. That could make it more reinforcing to pee on those areas. So potentially the animal will learn that certain surfaces are more reinforcing to pee on during that time. But the animal is healthy now, and animals learn to change their behaviour through consequences and through interactions. Over the last number of years, when I started talking to the client, understanding what was happening, we started learning that actually it's likely the cat's behaviour is functioning for a number of different reasons, but one of those was to get their attention. Every time the cat went to squat and pee on a soft surface, the human would give them attention, and they'd almost go and open the garden door or go and put some food down, and the cat was trying to communicate essentially with the human. And so that parrot, when they're chewing the curtain, what's the function of that behaviour? It could be that they haven't got things to chew on in the cage, but it could be that every time they chew the curtain, that's the only time when people go running up and give them attention. Or maybe they use a distraction. So by distraction I mean they give the animal something to chew on, a nut, and so the animal isn't chewing the curtains anymore. But potentially, if we look at it from a reinforcement point of view, the animal chews the curtain, we distract, and if that distraction means the animal in the long term carries on chewing the curtains, potentially our distraction is a reinforcer. It's worth mentioning that when we ask for behaviours, so we say touch or sit or lie down, if we think of these as commands, and that takes away almost the science of it. If we think of it more from a science point of view, cues or signals, they signal the availability of reinforcement or punishment contingent on a certain behaviour under those conditions. And so when I say the word touch, that signal tells my dog, or gives my dog information, that if they touch their nose to my hand, treats and food is available. So potentially, hearing the word touch could become a condition reinforcer because it's paired so closely with access to food. Now, if I have an animal who is about to bite another animal, or they're about to bite someone, or they're lunging at the end of a leash, barking and growling, and I say, Rover, touch, or I say, sit, or watch me, and then I click and treat, or I say, good, and give them a treat, we might think, well, we're paying them for sitting and looking at us, or we're paying them for turning towards us and touching our hand. And if we do that over and over again, potentially what could happen is the animal's learning that if they bark and they lunge at things, or if they go to displace the other animal, in that moment the trainer asks them to do a behaviour like sit, watch, touch, and then they can access more reinforcers. So they actually start to lunge, or they start to show those behaviours more often. Now, I'm not saying don't use cues to manage behaviours under certain conditions. If I'm working an animal and the animal's about to do something I don't want them to do, or they've just started to do it, I'm going to see how can I be most neutral in diffusing that situation. If I need to say touch, when the animal does touch, or say the animal's running after someone or chasing someone, I say come to me, or I give them a recall cue, and the animal comes running, I'm definitely going to pay that behaviour, because I'm going to animal stop doing what they were doing and they ran towards me. I'm going to pay them for running back to me in that moment in time. However, I'm going to make sure that in the future, under those conditions, that they don't even practice running after that person in the first place. So for example, if I'm in the park and a cyclist goes by, or a jogger goes by, and my dog starts running after them, and I say, Rover, come, and the dog comes running, I'm not going to punish them in that situation, because if I punish them, I'm punishing them for coming back to me, so the next time they're probably going to come a lot slower. I'm going to reinforce my dog and say, well done for coming back to me. I'm going to pay them highly, because I want my dog to learn that if you come away in a situation, that animal's chasing someone, you've called them, they come running to you, I'm going to pay that animal. However, the next time I see a jogger or a cyclist, I'm going to make sure that I may be further away. Or my dog's got a leash on, so they can't practice running after a jogger or cyclist. And the moment the jogger or cyclist comes into sight, I'm going to teach my animal through reinforcement what it is I want them to do. So before they start chasing, maybe it's just to look in that direction, or the moment they twitch their nose and they sniff in that direction, I'm going to say good, and I'm going to reinforce the behaviour. So they start learning when there's a jogger or a cyclist just looking in that direction, or looking at me, or sitting, or doing something else, chasing a toy, all the good stuff happens. And so we don't constantly set them up to fail, and then we have to try and distract them to get out of that situation. So when we think about punishment in general for animals, think, why is it that we're needing to punish that behaviour? Remember that punishment temporarily is going to stop behaviour, but long term all the evidence seems to suggest that it's not the best tool to use. And if we look at it from a learning point of view, if you read a lot of Skinner's early work, or Skinner's work throughout, he was a big advocate for focusing on reinforcement. He actually focused on punishment very little, and he actually even wrote more of a novel type book called The Walden 2, and it's based on sort of a society that focuses on living through positive reinforcement, and where punishes are sparse. And so if you're interested in reading that, you can look up the book. If I've got it with me, here we go, Walden 2. So that's the book, and you can have a read of that. And if you want something more sciencey, like I said, this book is excellent, and it goes through more of a science-based read. So when we think about punishers, think about why is it that we're wanting to punish a behaviour. Remember, the animal doesn't really choose to be in that situation in the first place. So maybe we need to actually say, what is it that we need to do different rather than the animal to change their behaviour. If it's a normal animal behaviour for them to show, then why are we trying to punish a dog for behaving like a dog? Maybe we need to be the ones who change our behaviour. And if we want to teach the animal to do things, then we need to focus on reinforcement rather than punishment. Now, I'm not saying, some people might focus on saying, well, Chirag said we never punish, or punishment never happens, or it doesn't work. I've not said that. Punishment does work. It reduces behaviour temporarily. It has lots of side effects. And I'm not saying that we never use punishment. We are going to use punishment just as a side effect of living with animals, the way we do things. When we put a leash on an animal, or we stop an animal from accessing something or a certain behaviour, or we take away things at the end of a training session, potentially those things are going to function to be something we're taking away something the animal wants, or we're adding in something the animal doesn't like, a leash in that situation. And so those behaviours are happening, those procedures are happening. However, when do we actively apply them to change behaviour? I would suggest that we work through an ethical hierarchy. Susan Friedman has one on her website. If you go to behaviourworks.org and you look at what's wrong with this picture, she has a great article showing an ethical hierarchy of how we might consider different procedures before we move to other ones. Because procedures aren't all the same. Some procedures are going to have more side effects than others. And so we start at the lowest and the least intrusive, and what's going to be most positive to the animal. And we do this every single time with every learner. So every time I have an animal in front of me, I start right at the bottom of that hierarchy, and I ask, is there any way that I can stick to the bottom of this hierarchy, whether that's changing the environment, so making sure the animal's got the right nutrition, the right physical setting, they're healthy. And then I move to saying, okay, how can I manage the antecedent arrangement? How can I arrange the environment so that the animal is less likely to need to show that behaviour in the first place? So can I put the dustbin in the cupboard? Or can I move the animal away from the curtain? And then we look at what positive reinforcement strategies can we use. So can I walk around and walk up to the bird cage every time the bird is sitting there calmly or chewing on one of their toys, and give them nuts and treats and attention and talk to them, and so that they don't have to bite the curtain in order to get that attention. And then I might escalate up the hierarchy as I need to. If I think, oh, I can't think of anything and this isn't working, I need to go up a level. Now, if we go up and we go to think we're going to apply an extinction procedure, or we're going to use differential reinforcement, or we're going to use more negative reinforcement, or we're going to use more positive punishment, rather than just saying, well, I think I've exhausted everything else I can do, we have speed bumps and we have warning signs. And what are those speed bumps from real life? The way I look at those speed bumps is those speed bumps are phone a friend. So if I have to go up that road of behaviour change, and if this doesn't make sense to you, if you look at the article of Susan's illustration, it's almost like a road with different turnings, and she kind of says take the first turning where possible, and as you go up the road, punishment's up there, reinforcement, positive reinforcement is down here. They're speed bumps. And so for me, those speed bumps are phone a friend, read a journal, go and read and find out what other people have done to deal with similar behaviours. And what you might find is if I phone a friend, I can see, I can see Marcus is watching this, or Hugo, Jill, Winnie. There's so many wonderful trainers who are watching this this live feed. I could phone any one of those. I can message them on Facebook and say, hey, I'm working with this animal or this client, and I'm trying to look at teaching the animal this behaviour, the animal does this, and I thought that I'm needing to use a positive punisher here. And they might look at it and say, oh, have you tried this? Or we tried this with another animal and it worked really well. And suddenly it takes me further back down that pathway, and I'm now at a more least intrusive procedure than I was a few moments ago. And so always have those speed bumps, and always for every single animal, don't just think, well, this is another dog that's growling, or this is another Labrador that's chewing, or this is another dog that's doing this, or another animal that's doing this. I've worked with sea lions for 50 years, or I've worked with tigers for 20 years, and so when they do this, I always have to punish them. No, ask for this individual animal in front of us, how can I start at the bottom of this pathway and work my way up only if I need to. And before I just start going, well, because this makes sense to me, well, it doesn't matter what makes sense to me, but what does the science say? What does the wider community say? What are the speed bumps? What do my friends say? What do other colleagues say? And then potentially we go up as we need to. So hopefully this has been useful. And on my last point that I'm going to make about punishers is a lot of the examples that I've used have been based on our animal learners. I want you to leave this live feed thinking about the human learners too. How many times when we're working with our human learners do we set them up to fail? Do we make it easier for them to get it wrong and harder for them to get it right? So for example, you're working at a vet practice and a client comes in and you want them to put eardrops in the cat's ear or the dog's ear, and the cat is likely to snarl or scratch or bite. And so when you send the client home and say, well, 2 drops in the left ear, 2 drops in the right, twice a day, are we setting them up to access reinforcement or access punishment? Potentially they haven't got the skills of doing it like the vet would. They haven't got 2 people to help hold the animal. They haven't taught the animal how to behave calmly in that situation. And so when the human doesn't put the eardrops in, often we blame the human. We say, well, they were not very compliant, or they just don't care. But did we arrange the environment for them to succeed, or did we arrange the environment for them to fail? Take a training example. We have a client come to us and their animal's doing something. We go to the house to do a behaviour consult. When we go back a couple of weeks later, did we leave them that first time with the opportunity to access lots of reinforcement, or did we make it likely that they're going to fail? A couple of examples might be, I go to someone's house. If I spend an hour and a half of a 2-hour consult talking to them, then I give them half an hour or 20 minutes of practice. And remember, in order for you to be able to do this skill, whether it's teaching the animal to touch a target, you probably had many years of practicing this, many hundreds of hours. Now you're expecting a client in 30 minutes or in 20 minutes, and in highly stressful situations, because it's all new, the client's in a behaviour consult, they don't maybe know what to expect, they're probably going to be more stressed. So under stressful conditions, we're expecting them to learn certain things, and if they're not successful, they don't do them the following week, we often say, well, they weren't very compliant, or that client's a difficult client. Well, maybe they're difficult for us in terms of their behaviour is difficult for us to work with because we're not experienced enough to arrange the environment to help them succeed. But the client themselves isn't difficult. So when we're working with our clients too, we have to think, how do I arrange the environment for my client to succeed and to make it easier for them to access reinforcers, and in order to, when they're doing something, they see success. Often that's going to reinforce their behaviour, and when I leave them, they're more likely to be able to get it right and do what I want them to do. And if they do something else, or they engage in a behaviour that you class as wrong, rather than judging them or saying, well, they just don't care, we need to ask, how do I rearrange the environment? How can I change the environment so that the client succeeds too? So we apply the same principles that we apply with our animal learners to the human learners that we work with as well. Because without influencing the human learners, very rarely is it that we just work with the animal directly. If we work in a zoo or we work with assistance dogs or something like that, we're training the dogs. However, even in those situations, we have managers, we have colleagues, we have people that we have to work with and manage behaviour of. And so most of the time, in order to actually be successful at managing animal behaviour, we have to be good at managing the humans as well. And there isn't a different strategy. A lot of times people think with humans, well, we'll talk. Well, yeah, talking isn't... Why do we try and focus on changing minds when it comes to people, but changing behaviour when it comes to animals? The way I think of it is, let's change behaviour of people and their beliefs will follow. I'm not a mind reader, I'm not a psychologist. If you're a psychologist, you can study the mind, or you can, whatever you're going to do. My focus is on behaviour. So when I go to a client, I don't suddenly change the area that I focus on, my skill level, and start analysing the client. My speciality or my qualifications or what I've learned and I'm best at doing is focusing on behaviour. And so when I go to my clients, I focus on changing their behavior rather than changing their mind. And often I find that if I can arrange the environment so my clients can change their behavior, they can access those reinforcers, suddenly their mind changes and their beliefs change. So when I see a client who comes in and says, well, my dog, I need to tell him off, and I need to hit him, or I need to spray him with a water can, or I need to give him a shock when he does this, rather than sitting down and trying to change their mind, my behavior is, how do I arrange the environment for them to access reinforcers and change their behavior? So I understand my client's behavior, I understand what the animal's doing, so I look at, what is the animal doing? Well, he chases dogs when I walk him outside, and so I need to spray him with the spray collar. Okay, and what is it that you'd like your dog to do when you walk outside and you see another dog? Often they'll say, well, I don't want him to chase. Okay, and so when he's not chasing, what would you like him to do? Would you like him to turn around and look at you, or walk by your side? And so we agree upon a behavior which is going to be conducive to the animal. And also we think about what function that behavior serves the animal. So if the dog is growling or barking when you walk down the street because there's another dog walking by, and potentially that behavior could function to escape or avoid. So rather than just teach the dog to look at me or walk by my side, I think, how am I going to teach that dog? They can still gain the function of being able to get the other dog to move away, but just by doing a different behavior. And so I'm going to say, we're going to teach the dog, if he looks in our direction, or he just looks at the other dog, we're going to cross the road. So now he still has a way of gaining that same function without needing to bark or growl or chase the other dog. But we're also going to teach him that around other dogs, when you engage in other behaviors, lots of good things happen. So we can change the way he feels about other dogs. We can also change what he does around other dogs. And so when we go outside, we arrange the environment, and I'll make it harder for my client to use a spray collar. And the way I'll do that is I'm going to help them feel safe. I'm going to make it harder for the dog to engage in the wrong behavior, so I'm going to help my dog feel safe. So I'm going to arrange the environment so maybe the other dogs are further away, or that when I've gone outside, the dog's water bowl's there, they've got a mat or something familiar that they can sniff, that makes them feel more relaxed. And so now the animal's going to be less likely to just start reacting or lunging or showing those behaviors straight away. The human, I might even have the other dog be no dog, or an imaginary dog, or I might have the other dog be a fake teddy bear. So now my client feels more relaxed and they're not feeling so anxious, and also they're less likely to want to press that button on the collar. I might ask them, can I hold on to the remote control so that you've got two hands to be able to hold the lead and be able to give your dog a treat in this moment? And so I'm going to arrange the environment in different ways to be able to set my client up for success. And I'm going to spend a long time practicing because it takes many repetitions to get to fluency. And also I'm going to generalize, so I'm going to work in lots of different situations, so my client learns when they're out with their dog, a dog appears in different directions, what behaviors I want my client to be able to do. Whether that be ask the dog to sit, look at them, touch, whatever it is that you're going to do, that's not the important point here, but I'm going to focus on teaching them those skills. And then when I leave them after that 2-hour session, they now have good practice, good reinforcement history of what behaviors that pay off when their dog is around another dog. And so when they practice those, they're more likely to work. And then suddenly, they have less reason to want to use the spray collar. Now there may be other reasons they're using the spray collar, and the following week we can address a few of those issues. But if I make my client feel bad, and I make them feel like I'm judging them from the moment they walk in, so if they go to say something and they say, well, I spray him, and the first thing that comes out of my mouth is, oh really? Well, we're going to work on maybe not doing that because that's not so good for the animal. And I might have said it in a very sympathetic way. However, how does a client feel in that moment potentially? If you've been doing something and someone says it in a way that you think, oh wow, that person just thought, look at their face, or I wonder what they're thinking, are they judging me? Now suddenly you're having this conversation in your head rather than focusing on what it is that you're working on with that person? So do your clients start going off in their own little head, as opposed to focusing on learning what you're trying to teach them? Also, if you feel like the person's judging you, suddenly the conversation becomes less safe. So there's a book called Crucial Conversations, and they talk about the conversation becomes less safe, and almost what happens is you start now putting up walls. So the rest of the conversation becomes about defending yourself or defending what you're doing. So now maybe the client's going to be using their verbal behavior, they're going to be saying things to defend themselves or create a safe environment again, as opposed to be open to a learning environment and focusing on what we want them to change. And most of us know when we've done something we're not meant to do. We don't need someone to tell us that was wrong. And so we don't need to be there saying to a client, well, you're wrong. So let's focus on the same things that we do with our animal learners, with our with our human learners too. So, any questions? I can see my mum's watching from India. Hello mum, how are you? Well, if you are asking any questions, I can't see them, and so maybe someone can reinforce my behaviour of looking at the comments box by saying something, so then I feel like, yay, someone's talking to me. Let's have a look on here. Okay, well, if there's no questions, or I can't see any questions appear, then hope you guys... here we go. There are some questions, I just can't see them on my phone while I'm talking to you, so I'm going to use my laptop here, and I can answer them. So, my mum said hello back, so hello, and hello to everyone else. Hi Megan, hi Paul, hi Hugo. Okay, that was, the end was interesting. I'd like to ask you what you do when an owner tells you that the dog is doing something because he wants to avenge him or so. So that's a really good question, what do I do if the caregiver is saying, well, the dog is doing this because he wants to, because he hates me, or he's trying to, of course, get some kind of revenge. So I generally tend to focus back onto saying, I can't, sadly, I don't know what the dog is thinking, but in my previous experience, I have seen that that's often not, they'll often behave for many other reasons rather than revenge. So often there's situations because they don't feel so safe or uncomfortable. Then I'm going to start to focus on what is it that he does? Can you give me an example? And so I'm going to try and get back to the behaviour and work out under what conditions does the behaviour occur, the antecedents and the consequences. And then I'm going to look at, okay, so you say that when you sit down to watch TV, your dog will start to grab hold of your socks or grab hold of the sofa and start to tear it to pieces. And the human explanation is, well, he's jealous, I'm not giving him any attention, or he's trying to tell me, or he's trying to get back at me for some reason. So what I'll say is, when you sit down, what is it that we want the dog to do? And also remember, I'm asking what function does it serve the behaviour? So I'm trying to work out, what does the dog get out of chewing the furniture? And so if I think the dog is trying to potentially gain attention, gain reinforcers or treats or toys, then I'm going to say, well, let's teach him, when you sit down, that we're going to give him a stuffed Kong. Or when you sit down, we're going to give him we're going to call him over, and we're going to ask him to go sit on his bed, and then we're going to call him back, play with him, go ask him to sit on his bed, call him back, play with him, and I'm going to have the client start practicing that. If the client goes, oh, okay, so how am I going to make him feel less like he wants to be revengeful? Well, I say, let's teach him using what we're doing now, and I'll come back to focusing on changing the behaviour. And often what happens is the client actually can see, and I'll video this as well, so when the client is working our video training session, I'll say, okay, now sit down on the sofa, and good, pay your dog for lying in his bed. Now sit down, get up, sit back down on the sofa. Now when they sit back on the sofa, they see the dog go running to his bed, and I'll say, look, it's working already. Every time you sit on the sofa, the dog's running to their bed. Now suddenly almost that explanation disappears, and we can also start to make the explanation more about the environment and say, well, we've seen that every time you sit down, the dog starts chewing the furniture, and you tell the dog off, or you go and distract them. Maybe the dogs learn that when you sit on the sofa, the best way to get your attention is by chewing the furniture. So now, by you giving them attention by lying in their bed, they're getting that same outcome. So I'll bring the explanation more into the environment rather than the animal's head, and then also I'll show them some success. So I'll try and change their behaviour in that moment. Okay. They are difficult clients. The client isn't difficult. What we mean by this, and that is difficult for us to arrange the environment for them to succeed. So Joshua James asked, potentially, what do I mean by the client isn't difficult, they're difficult for us? What I'm saying is, when I come across a client, or I'm working with my students and say to me, that client was difficult, well, they were difficult for us in terms of to manage their behaviour, but we're not labelling them as a difficult client. They weren't. How do we know they were coming about or trying to behave in a difficult way? They were just behaving based on how their environment has set them up to behave. Maybe they've just had a really stressful day at work, or a family member is sick, or they've had to get their children ready to go to school before they brought the puppy to training class, and so they turn up late, or when they do turn up late, they seem a little bit frazzled, or they say something and it seems slightly rude, or often there's things going on in their environment that's going to influence the way they behave. So rather than labelling that person as a difficult person, we look at what is in the environment that could be changing that. And often I don't know what's happening in people's environments. What I do know is that I can arrange my environment so when they turn up to class, it's full of lots of reinforcers. Judy Vargas, Skinner's daughter, has a quote in her book, and I have her book on my shelf as well. So it's this one here, which is excellent. It's called Behaviour Analysis for Effective Teaching by Dr. Judy Vargas. There we go. She has in that book a quote, and it goes along the lines of people punish others when they've lost control. And so people are more likely to be more punishing when they feel like they've lost control, or they don't have much control over their environment. When their life is full of punishers. Potentially, the other quote is, difficult people have difficult lives. I've heard that one being said as well. And I often think when people are showing behaviours that we class as difficult, potentially their life situations might be difficult as well for them. And so by us trying to punish them more, so for example, if someone comes late to a training class, we say, we're going to have them wait outside for 5 minutes because they were late, so they learn to come earlier. Well, punishing their behaviour of turning up isn't going to make them teach them to come early. Punishment doesn't teach them to behaviours. Punishment reduces behaviour temporarily. And like I said, there's lots of side effects. But also potentially that person already has a difficult situation. Maybe they have to work extra hours because that's the only way they make the income to pay their mortgage. And then the fact that to take an effort to come to puppy class, they turn up late. Well, that's fine. At least they've turned up. If they didn't turn up at all, we wouldn't be able to help that animal and that client. So for me, is when people turn up and they forgot something, they do something, rather than saying, well, that client is being difficult, if you go to a checkout and someone looks miserable, you say, that person looks really unhappy. Or you're at a restaurant and you say, well, that waiter has attitude. Well, maybe the waiter isn't a rude person per se. Their life situation or their environment influences their behaviour. So potentially their environment has a lot of punishers, and that influences the way they behave. And so one of the things that I'll try and focus on doing based on my philosophy is thinking, how can I provide some reinforcers in the environment? How can I maybe I'll leave a bigger tip for them, so next time I go back, I'm going to have influenced their behaviour. Maybe when people come in, they don't take the time to give eye contact or smile or have a conversation or ask, how's your day going? That person's run off their feet, and often people come in, they just bark in orders. And so maybe I'll just behave slightly differently to see if I can arrange the environment to influence that person's behaviour. So that's what I meant by arranging the environment, and rather than thinking of them as a difficult person, think that they're difficult for us to deal with. And maybe we need to go away and become better educated in how to deal with that behaviour if we're finding it difficult. And that's completely fine. we're not going to be able to have all the skills to deal with everything. That takes time, and we're always going to be learning. So we have a network of colleagues and friends that we can work with, and maybe someone else is able to work better with that person. Pardon me. Who wrote Crucial Conversations? So Crucial Conversations is, I've got that on my bookshelf as well. So here we go. And thank you, Emma, for actually answering that question in the chat. So a number of people asked, who wrote Crucial Conversations? Okay, let's see if there's any other questions before I go off. So someone's asking about me mentioning whether sometimes I'd say I'd have a bowl or a mat available in the environment, see if that helps relax the dog in that situation. And they're saying about it could be a massive negative if the dog guards those objects. And yeah, definitely. Bear in mind the examples I've used were just examples, so I'm not advocating that in that situation you always do this recipe sheet. For me, behavior is individual. We have to consider the individual's learning history, the environment, the study of the animal in front of us, and then we decide what we're going to do to change that environment or change the behavior. And so when I given examples, these are just examples for sort of demonstration purposes, rather than saying to you, in this situation you have to go away and do A, B and C. So okay, well, I'm going to stop there, and hopefully you guys have enjoyed the live feed. If you have any comments or suggestions, please feel free to post them below. If it's useful, you think it will be useful to your clients, feel free to share this with your clients. I'll make it available afterwards on Facebook so that you can watch it, and if you weren't able to be here live with us, hopefully you'll be able to catch up. And if you're interested in, some people asking about workshops or seminars, you can go on the Facebook page and look at events, and there's some events on there that's coming up next year where I'll be teaching, where hopefully you guys can join us. If you have any suggestions for other live feeds or things that you'd like to discuss, then please feel free to write them on the comments box, and hopefully we can do another live feed soon. Have a great evening or morning or day wherever you guys are, and yeah, I'll speak to you later.